Hello, everybody, and welcome to Backfired, an NBA history podcast about bad teams, bad luck, and bad decisions. My name is Lewis, and on today's episode, we're going to talk about the 2015-16 Memphis Grizzlies and their unimaginable bad luck. It was only a matter of time before I talked about the Grizzlies. This is actually one of the teams that inspired me to do this podcast in the first place. This is actually the first episode that I wrote, so for me to wait this long to record it and release it is outstanding self-control by me. This team was lovingly referred to as the Goon Squad. 28 different players suited up for the Grizzlies this year, and the guys who played the most down the stretch of the season were a group of characters, so they definitely earned that nickname. This was a team that was really fun to follow at the time, despite how horrible they were. I mean, you knew by watching them that they had no shot of doing anything meaningful in the postseason. But this episode is kind of a case study for what the worst possible outcome is for a team projected to be a top 4 playoff team that then just has every single thing go wrong for them. And it's truly a worst case scenario because they were this horrible team, but then didn't even get a lottery pick out of the deal. But still, even though this is one of the darkest times in my favorite team's recent history, it was still really fun to research and think about and watch some of the games. And, it really grew on me at the time. And I and other Grizzlies fans still look back on this season with fond memories. So, let's find out why. So let's go back to the summer of 2015. In the 5 years preceding that summer, the Grizzlies had grown from a failing team in recurring sale and relocation rumors to a legitimate force in the Western Conference. In the first 9 years since relocating from Vancouver to Memphis, the team had won 0 playoff games, not a single one. Pau Gasol, Shane Battier, Mike Miller, as great as those guys were, they couldn't even win a single game in the postseason. But since then, they had won 4 playoff series and made the postseason 5 years in a row. And at worst, they were tough out in the playoffs for any team. But for the last 3 years, they had been a dark horse NBA title contender. In 2013, they beat the Lob City Clippers in the first round. They beat the Oklahoma City Thunder, who were missing Russell Westbrook, in the second round. They advanced to the Western Conference Finals, but were swept by the San Antonio Spurs. In 2014, the Thunder got their revenge, defeating the Grizzlies in 7 games in the first round. 4 of those games went into overtime. And Zach Randolph, you gotta love this guy. He was suspended from Game 7 for punching the rookie Steven Adams in the face. And as you'd expect, the combination of Kevin Durant, Russell Westbrook, and the mortal enemy of all Grizzlies fans, Reggie Jackson, was too much for the shorthanded Grizzlies to overcome. In 2015, the Grizzlies easily defeated the Portland Trailblazers in the first round, and then led the eventual champions, the Golden State Warriors, 2-1 in the second round before being overpowered. So the Grizzlies had shown in recent years that they could at least make the best teams in the league break a sweat, but it was tough to get through the Western Conference. It was an absolute bloodbath. In 2014, the Phoenix Suns finished with 48 wins and didn't even make the playoffs. In the past 3 seasons, the Grizzlies had won 56 games, 50 games, and 55 games, respectively, but that had only ever given them the 5th seed, 7th seed, and 5th seed again. What would have been a top 3 seed in the Eastern Conference in each of those seasons didn't even give the Grizzlies home court advantage in the West. Most of the league's most dominant teams at the time were in the West. The reigning champion Warriors, the Spurs, the Thunder, and the Clippers still had an outside chance at contending as well. If the Grizzlies were going to thrust themselves into the top tier of the NBA, they would have to retain their all-star center, Marc Gasol, who was an unrestricted free agent. Luckily, Gasol re-signed without even scheduling meetings with any other teams, and then to back him up, the Grizzlies signed Brandon Wright, who was a serviceable bench big when healthy, but he was just never healthy. On draft night, they selected Jarrell Martin out of LSU with the 25th pick, and then they made a trade with the Clippers to get Matt Barnes, just the ultimate hate him if he's not on your team kind of guy. Luckily for him, he played for 9 different teams, so he has a bunch of people in his corner. After cutting all the training camp bodies, the Grizzlies had their opening night roster set, returning just under 80% of the last season's minutes. So I'll go through the opening night roster. There were the team's best players, affectionately referred to as the Core Four. Marc Gasol, the center, originally from Spain, but went to high school in Memphis thanks to his older brother Pau playing for the Grizzlies. He was the Defensive Player of the Year in 2013. He's slow, but he's methodical. He's brainy. Part of the reason the Grizzlies were 30th in pace in 2013 and 2014 was that Gasol would get the ball in the high post at the elbow and then just hold the ball over his head, surveying the court, and then he would either pass the ball to a cutter or an open shooter, or just shoot a mid-range jumper that no one could really contest, especially in 2013 when he was shooting almost 50% on long twos. If you traded his defensive prowess to accentuate all of his offensive skills to even higher levels, you'd essentially have Nikola Jokic. They have a very similar MO on offense. And I know Jokic is getting better on defense, but he's not touching how Gasol was. There's Mike Conley, the point guard who started his career as the third stringer behind Damon Stoudemire and Kyle Lowry. Conley had a shaky start to his career once he was drafted fourth overall out of Ohio State, but he eventually beat out Lowry for the starting position. Lowry was then traded to Houston. He overcame the distraction of having Allen Iverson on the team for a couple of months. And over the course of his career, Conley had blossomed from just being a defensive specialist to a competent floor general, and then finally becoming a legitimate offensive threat from pretty much everywhere on the court. He was a plus 3-point shooter. He had a consistent offhand floater, and he was just a killer for a few years there. Next up was Tony Allen on the wing, an absolute defensive menace. He was coming off his fourth all-defensive nod in 5 seasons, but wasn't a great scorer like he had been in college at Oklahoma State. For the entirety of his time with the Grizzlies, he had averaged between 8 and 10 points per game, but he came to the Grizzlies with championship experience after winning in 2008 with the Boston Celtics. And then there's Zach Randolph at power forward. The Grizzlies traded for him in 2009, which was a very unpopular move at the time because of Randolph's reputation around the league. He was a former member of the Jailblazers up in Portland, but he became an all-star in his first season in Memphis, and in his second season, he propelled the Grizzlies not only to their first ever playoff game win, but their first ever playoff series victory when he hit the dagger three-pointer in Game 6 of their first-round series against the Spurs. When he arrived, he was a castaway. He'd been traded from 3 different teams in the span of 2 years for very little in return, but he turned into the heart and soul of the franchise and now is just a universally beloved player with a retired jersey. There were Matt Barnes, Jarrell Martin, and Brandon Wright, and then the rest of the team were Jordan Adams, a second-year guard who had a number of right knee injuries. He was the 22nd pick in the 2014 draft. The fans and the coaching staff both really, really wanted Rodney Hood from Duke, but the front office selected Adams out of UCLA while Hood went to the Utah Jazz with the following pick. I'm not going to pretend that Rodney Hood is incredible, but he's really good for a late first-round pick. Much better than Jordan Adams was, who never even got on the court. Vince Carter, the former superstar in his second year in Memphis, he came to shoot threes, and that is it, and we love him for it. JaMychal Green, a big and a D-League standout who impressed the team so much in his 2 10-day contracts the previous season that they signed him to a 3-year, $2 million contract. Jeff Green, this was the first time that Jeff and JaMychal Green were teammates. Of course, they were teammates on the Nuggets again this past season. Jeff is a frustratingly inconsistent forward who the Grizzlies had traded for in the middle of the last season in an attempt to keep the team spry. In the deal where the Grizzlies acquired Jeff Green, they also traded a heavily protected first-round pick, which finally conveyed to the Boston Celtics in 2020. Trading that pick really messed some things up for the Grizzlies, and I'm still extremely bitter about it. Courtney Lee, a solid shooter. He was the team's only real catch-and-shoot threat and did not take very many threes, unfortunately. Russ Smith is a scoring point guard from the University of Louisville who came over in the Jeff Green trade. He was a bench warmer, barely ever played. To this day, though, Grizzlies fans in Facebook groups will post Russ Smith's stat lines from the G League or from China's minor league where he'll score a bunch and they'll be like, oh, we need to sign this guy. Even though he's not good enough to play even in China's major league, he scored 81 points in 2017, so let's give him a contract. Jarnell Stokes, another bench warmer, a Memphis native who played at the University of Tennessee, and then Beno Udrih, who's a Slovenian point guard. He is Mike Conley's backup, still a fan favorite to this day. I still see tweets about Beno Udrih and from Beno Udrih about his time in Memphis, so he clearly loved it. So this roster had a lot of continuity, 4 great players, a couple of good ones. And, they had big expectations. In 2015, they won 55 games. And for the 2016 season, the Vegas over-under suggested more of the same. They had the 8th highest over-under win total set at 50.5. And then they had the 8th best title odds tied with the Pelicans at 33-1. So they were definitely outsiders to win the title, but still a very good team. And if the bracket broke right for them, they had a chance to make a run. Immediately, though, they proved that they weren't in the top tier of the league. In their home opener, they lost to the Cavaliers by 30 points, and then 5 days later to the Warriors by 50. Two huge losses to last year's final teams. About a week later, the Grizzlies were 3-6, so of course something had to change. And the change that came was a big blow to the fans. They traded Beno Udrih, the fan favorite, and Memphis native Jarnell Stokes to the Miami Heat for James Ennis and Mario Chalmers. What made this such a huge blow wasn't losing Beno because, at the end of the day, Beno was a role player. He was the backup point guard. He wasn't the heart and soul of the team. Losing him is okay. You're going to be okay. What was bad was that Chalmers was absolutely hated in Memphis. He was despised. And it wasn't for anything he had done in the NBA because, he had an established track record as a winning NBA player. He was the starting point guard for 2 championship teams in Miami, but it was something he had done in college. In the 2008 national championship game, Chalmers and his team, the Kansas Jayhawks, trailed the Memphis Tigers by 9 points with 2 minutes left in the game. With 2 seconds left in the game, after way too many missed free throws by the Tigers, Chalmers hit a three-pointer over Derrick Rose's outstretched arms that sent the game into overtime where the Jayhawks finished Memphis off. Since then, Chalmers had been booed by the Grizzlies crowd during most of the Heat's visits to Memphis, and then when news of the trade broke, there's a huge negative reaction from fans on Twitter. And I vividly remember where I was when the trade broke because I was so angry about it. It was definitely a moment for me. Like many other players in my life who came to Memphis, I said, I'm never going to cheer for this guy. I hate him. I don't care what he does. I'm not rooting for him. Well, that lasted about 3 days. The Grizzlies won the first 4 games that Chalmers played in, and in his second home game in Memphis, Chalmers came off the bench and scored 16 of his 29 points in the fourth quarter to propel the Grizzlies to a win over the Thunder, who I always viewed as kind of a soft rival. After the initial surge of wins from acquiring Chalmers, the Grizzlies settled into a groove. They'd win a couple, lose one, win one, lose a couple, and that put them squarely at 16-16 on the day after Christmas. On that day, the Grizzlies officially ruled out Jordan Adams for the season, which would wind up being the end of his NBA career. And 2 days later, they waived Russ Smith and signed Ryan Hollins. From this point onward, the team played well, albeit against an easy schedule. From December 27th to February 5th, the Grizzlies went 14-4. They destroyed a bunch of bottom feeders and then lost to the only contender that they faced in that stretch, which was the Thunder. This put the Grizzlies at 30-20, but with just 3 games remaining until the All-Star break, disaster struck. Marc Gasol fractured his right foot during a game against Portland, and although he would make a full recovery and have the best season of his career the following year, he was out for the remainder of the season. And that really ended any hopes of contending for even home court advantage in the playoffs. Certainly, whatever small championship hopes the team had went out the window. So at the trade deadline, the front office decided to cut weight and try to make some marginal moves to plan for the future. They made a 3-team trade with the Miami Heat and the Charlotte Hornets. They gave up Courtney Lee and received PJ Harrison, Chris Anderson, and 4 second-round picks. And then 2 days later, they shipped Jeff Green to the Clippers for Lance Stevenson and a first-round pick. The Commercial Appeals Chris Harrington wrote that those deals, particularly the Green for Stevenson swap, were more about the picks than the players involved. Courtney Lee was an expiring contract, so they got some value for him. Trading him got Memphis the pick that they traded for the pick that they used for Dylan Brooks, who, of course, is an important player on the Grizzlies, certainly made himself expendable here in the playoffs against the Warriors, but that is another story. The Grizzlies eventually traded each of the 4 picks that conveyed, and in addition to Brooks, that netted them the draft rights to Deontay Davis and Ivan Rabb. Neither of them really became anything, but especially Deontay was a worthwhile swing to take. And then they received a first-round pick for Jeff Green's expiring contract. They got to take a chance on Lance Stevenson, who had a team option, so he could either be brought back for another year or just sent off as an expiring. There's a great SBNation article about that trade saying that the Clippers had finally gotten the big forward that they needed. That article has certainly been written about Jeff Green everywhere he's gone and almost every time he's disappointed. But for the time being, these trades were where the Grizzlies, started to begin to look goonish. You got Lance, who's extremely erratic, the most memorable moment of his career, despite his contributions to a legitimate title contender in Indiana, was blowing into LeBron James's ear in an attempt to get into his head. And to call him eccentric would be an understatement. He left the Pacers for a larger role in Charlotte and then was quickly traded to the Clippers, so he needed a place to try to get his mojo back. And they had received Hairston as well for Lee. PJ Hairston's professional career started a bit earlier than he had planned after he was suspended from UNC for receiving improper benefits. After he was suspended, he went to the G League and then into the NBA draft. There's Chris Anderson. His hops and his wingspan had earned him the nickname Birdman. There's a Fox Sports article about him where his tattoo artist estimates that he has about 2/3 of his body covered in ink, including a big free bird across his neck. Unfortunately, Birdman had served a multi-year drug suspension from the league before rejoining the Denver Nuggets, where he nearly led the league in blocks in 2009. In 2012, he was waived by the Nuggets for salary cap reasons, and then wasn't picked up until mid-season in 2013 when the Miami Heat gave him a 10-day contract, and that was because of a very strange, off-court catfishing incident where he was catfished by a woman in Canada. It's one of the most insane and confusing stories I've ever heard because the woman who he was being catfished by was different from the woman that he met up with, but she was also being catfished by the same woman. It's extremely strange. It was some hermit in Manitoba named Shelley Chartier. She is absolutely the freak of the week. Please, just Google Birdman catfish and you will be entertained and confused. But Birdman's characteristic hustle earned him a spot on the Heat for 3 more seasons after his initial 10-day contract, and he went to multiple finals appearances and won a championship before being traded to Memphis. And then Matt Barnes, who had been suspended for part of the season for an off-court incident involving his former teammate on the Lakers, who is now the head coach of the Knicks, that is Derek Fisher. Barnes found out that Fisher was dating his ex-wife behind his back and was making his twin sons uncomfortable. So Barnes drove 95 miles from Grizzlies training camp to his ex-wife's house, hopped the fence, and punched Fisher in the face. Later in the season, Barnes would be suspended again, but this time for running into the Milwaukee Bucks locker room to confront John Henson after the two were ejected from a game. Yeah, it was a crazy combination of players, and I'm not sure which player actually started it, but it was Mike Conley that put it out into the public. They acknowledged how insane it was to have this many characters on the roster, and they called themselves the Goon Squad. Right after the All-Star break, the Grizzlies beat the Timberwolves, and Conley said in an interview, quote, "This team that we have now, we call ourselves the Goon Squad. We play hard, play together, rely on each other, and have fun." Somehow, despite injuries to Birdman and Tony Allen and Brandon Wright and plenty of others, Mike Conley and Zach Randolph were able to drag this team to a 6-3 stretch after the All-Star break. But then they got more bad news. On March 7th, it was discovered that Conley would miss the remainder of the season with tendonitis in his left Achilles. And then 2 nights later, Mario Chalmers ruptured his Achilles and was waived to the next day. So when it rains, it pours. But what followed was an insane run of transactions that I don't think has been emulated other than the COVID replacement players in late 2021. On March 11th, the Grizzlies signed Briante Weber to a 10-day contract. His college career at VCU had ended abruptly with an MCL and ACL tear when he was just 12 steals away from setting the NCAA record. He started his first NBA game that very night and guided his new team to an overtime win over the Pelicans. He had 10 points and 7 assists. Not a bad debut at all for an undrafted guy. The next day, the Grizzlies gave 10-day contracts to Ray McCallum, who had been waived by the Spurs 2 weeks earlier, and Alex Stevenson, who had spent most of his professional career in the Mediterranean region, but came to Memphis from the Iowa Energy. If I had been playing basketball in Istanbul and Ljubljana and Athens, and then I found myself in Des Moines, Iowa, I might jump off a building. McCallum started over Weber that night, and 2 days after that, Stevenson pulled down 13 offensive rebounds against the Rockets, which is still tied for a single-game franchise record. On the 16th of March, the Grizzlies signed Xavier Munford, and then on the 21st, 2-time NBA champion Jordan Farmar to replace Weber. Farmar had backed up Derek Fisher when the Lakers won their back-to-back championships in 2009 and 2010, but now he was playing in Tel Aviv. And now I'll use Farmar's first start as the cutoff date to give a status report on the state of the Grizzlies. On the night that Gasol went down, they fell to 30-22, and there were warning signs that the team wasn't that good even before that. They were 22nd in offense and only 17th in defense, and a good chunk of their wins came in pretty close games. After Conley's last game, they were 37-25. So they had risen up to 15th in offense and 16th in defense. They went on a hot streak on offense post Gasol and then pretty much maintained their same level of middle of the pack team defense. Now it's March 25th, and the Grizzlies are 41-32. So 11-10 overall since Gasol went down, but only 4-7 since Conley's injury. And since Conley's injury, obviously a small sample size, but the numbers are just absolutely horrendous. They're 26th in offense and defense, both in that stretch. And the only teams worse overall in that stretch are the Suns, the Magic, and the 76ers. And the Sixers are obviously trying to lose every game that they can. So it's bad to be in their company when you're not trying to be. In Farmar's first start, they go on to lose a pretty valiant effort against the Spurs, who are absolutely destroying the league. The story this year was that everybody was looking forward to a 7-game series between the Spurs and the Warriors, because even though the Warriors are on pace to challenge the Bulls record and win 70-plus games, the Spurs are not that far behind them. This win over the Grizzlies brought the Spurs up to 61 wins, while the Warriors had 65. And the Grizzlies only lost this one by 6. They came back from being down 15 right before halftime, thanks to a nice third quarter. But here are the guys that played for the Grizzlies. They started Jordan Farmar at point guard, Tony Allen at shooting guard, Matt Barnes at small forward, JaMychal Green at power forward, and Birdman at center. And Birdman is now going by Grizzilla, by the way. And then here's the bench. Ray McCallum, Vince Carter, Jarrell Martin, the rookie draft pick, Ryan Hollins, Xavier Munford, and Lance Stevenson. Even though by default he became one of the team's best players, they only started Lance 3 times during this entire season. But doesn't this just sound like a bad team? I mean, there are some guys that honestly, some of the listeners probably haven't ever heard of. A lot of Grizzlies fans may have blocked some of these names out. And if you go back and watch the Grizzlies around this time, you can see that they are exhausted at this point in the season. Some of these guys don't belong in an NBA game at all. There's no chemistry. They're all just trying to get through the season, or in the case of the 10-day contract guys, get their next contract. They're playing hard, but they're playing really poorly. So, like I said, 26th in both offense and defense. But the fact that they're still trying, sometimes making games close and sometimes even winning a game or two, made them really endearing to the fans. If you go on to an SBNation fan site or search Goon Squad Grizzlies on Twitter, it's all people celebrating this really weird, really bad team. And it's so late in the season that nobody's rooting for them to lose games or anything because it's too late to tank. And win or lose, the Grizzlies can't shake the 5th seed until later on. They were the 5th seed in the West from January 24th all the way up until April 8th, when there were only 5 days left in the regular season. So people just kind of gravitated toward this team that has a next man up mentality and are trying really hard, but just keep getting beaten over and over. After this Spurs game, they only win one more game all year. And finally, mercifully, their last game is the second night of a back-to-back against the Golden State Warriors, who beat them to seal the NBA record 73rd win of the season. And this game is emblematic of the Grizzlies' entire season. In that game, 2 gigantic things happened. The Warriors clinched the best record of all time, and Steph Curry hit his 400th three-pointer in the season. But to add insult to injury, hardly anybody outside of the Bay Area even watched this game because it was on at the same time as Kobe Bryant's last game. So it was a super niche team that played together for a third of the season and just got donkey punched night in and night out. But because of the team's early success, their season isn't over. They still made the playoffs despite losing 14 of their last 17 games. The loss to the Warriors dropped the Grizzlies down into 7th place, which set them up for a matchup with the San Antonio Spurs, who've just had the Grizzlies number since 1995. They've played 131 times, and the Grizzlies have only won 39 of those games. That is under a 30% winning percentage. But this is where the team really goes under a microscope, because for at least 4 more games in a row, they're on national television. And it goes about like you'd expect when a 67-win team is hosting a 42-win team. From literally the first basket of Game 1, the Grizzlies are completely overmatched. Chris Anderson is trying to do a dribble handoff with Matt Barnes, and Kawhi Leonard grabs it, runs down, dunks it on the other end. The only thing that Barnes does is just look at Anderson, palms up like, what just happened? Vince Carter is the only one to even pretend to try to get back. And you go possession by possession in this game, and it's just Tony Parker blowing by Birdman, Patty Mills shooting threes with nobody in the zip code, Boris Diaw posting up at the three-point line. Kawhi got 4 steals. The Spurs got to put in Boban Marjanovic. It's just a bloodbath. The Grizzlies scored 13 points in the first quarter, and it went downhill from there. So they lose Game 1 by 32 and Game 2 by 26. Then after Game 2, Matt Barnes, who, for better or for worse, is the spiritual leader of the team, he vows to Memphis fans that when the series goes back to Memphis, they're going to see a better result. He tells Jeff Calkins, a local columnist, that the Grizzlies, quote, went into a gunfight with spoons, which is a perfect analogy, and then said that in the next game they were going to bring, quote, forks, spoons, knives, the sharpening knife, whatever we got, can openers, wine bottle openers. And then the day of game 3, the Grizzlies' Twitter account posted this picture of a placemat with a fork, knife, spoon, can opener, and corkscrew on top of it. On the placemat is like a beaten up version of the Grizzlies logo. I couldn't find the original source of it, but if I remember correctly, it originated on the NBA forum of some Japanese message board and then was cross-posted onto Reddit. But it was the usual Grizzlies logo, but with stitches over one eye, a nicked up cheek, a chunk taken out of the ear, and it had text underneath it that read beat up but not beat down. And just to illustrate even further how much the fans are getting into this, the Grizzlies go into game 3, and there are literally people holding forks and spoons up in the crowd. I have no idea how they got that through security, by the way. But the Grizzlies are down after the first quarter and at halftime, but after the third quarter, they're holding a 1-point lead. Up until game 3, they'd led in the series for a total of 25 seconds, so leading at all, and especially at home, was a pretty big deal. In the break between the third and the fourth quarter, the in-arena experience folks pull out all the greatest hits. They have the Grizz mascot throw the Spurs coyote through a folding table. They play Whoop That Trick from the movie Hustle and Flow. And since it's a sellout, the fourth quarter is pretty exciting. The teams trade baskets for most of the quarter before the Spurs pull away and then finally win by 9 points. The Spurs won Game 4 by 21 points, completing the sweep that everybody knew was coming. They posted a plus 25 net rating, which is the largest playoff series victory by net rating since 2009 when the Denver Nuggets beat Chris Paul's New Orleans Hornets. It was a complete domination from start to finish. Greg Popovich told reporters after the game that he respected the Grizzlies for coming out and playing hard to the very end, even though everybody knew that it wasn't a fair fight. And then after the game, Dave Yeager was brought to tears, eulogizing the season.
It's a tough battle, but as far as, this game, this series, and this season, I hope you guys all took notice of what happened in the last 3 minutes of the game because, Matt and Vince, they wanted to finish the game. And I think that's what Grizzlies basketball is about. Those guys are pros, and for what we've been through, they've embraced every guy who came in, no matter what their history was. They cared about them. They tried to have them. These guys fought, and I can't tell you enough how proud I am of every guy that is in that locker room and has come through that locker room. This season's been hard. It's been really hard. And they could have quit. Could have not made the playoffs. And every day they came out and they fought like crazy. This was not planned. So I hope as a community, and I know we do, we love our Grizzlies. We love on those guys, and wish them the best as they go forward in their career, and hopefully, a long time with us. That's all I got today. Thank you for a great season.
Going into the next season, the team fired Yeager after 3 seasons, despite him having the best win percentage in team history, and essentially went on to make a bunch of other moves to stave off the impending rebuild that would all wind up backfiring. Wink. They hired David Fizdale as the coach, wasted all their draft picks, and attempted to retool the roster with Conley and Gasol back healthy by signing Chandler Parsons to a max contract, which is a story for another day. I'll just leave you with this little bit of cosmic irony. This team, of course, was ravaged by injury all season long. 28 separate players suited up for the Grizzlies during this season, which became the NBA record. I've mentioned all 28 of them by name except for Elliot Williams and Bryce Cotton. But despite this, when you compared their win total to the expected win total, the Grizzlies were actually the second luckiest team in the league, behind only the 73-win Warriors. Their stats indicated that they should have won 35 games, but they won 42. Calling them lucky for what they had to go through to get to the finish line may seem a little insensitive. When you think about the opportunities that this team gave a bunch of guys who were cast off from their former teams, fighting for their place in the league, some sharing apartments with 3 D-League teammates in Bakersfield, California, or spending their nights alone in Istanbul, 7,000 miles away from their families. And when you think about how quickly each player was embraced by their teammates and by their new city, so much so that they received an extended standing ovation in the final seconds of a season-ending blowout loss, I guess you could say they were pretty lucky. So that is the story of the Goon Squad Grizzlies. Thank you very much for listening. Hope you enjoyed. Hope you learned something. And we will talk next week. Have a good one.